Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we look at the history of political polling in the UK. The very first general election polls were for the 1945 election, where wartime leader Winston Churchill was ousted in what was seen as a shock result. However, it wouldn't have been as great a shock if people had placed confidence in the Gallup polling for the News Chronicle, which had been showing landslide-level Labour leads for the previous 2 years. Indeed, Gallup's final election poll was only 1 point out for both Labour and Tory. After that auspicious start, there have been many polling setbacks at UK elections, notably in 1970, when the polls misled Harold Wilson into dashing to the ballot box, and 1992, when John Major defied the polls to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. However, with modern statistical techniques, the pollsters claim that they get more elections right than wrong. From the earliest coverage of television elections, the pollsters themselves have become the story, with Sir David Butler and Robert Mackenzie pioneering the celebrated swingometer. Their modern equivalent is Professor Sir John Curtice, who reigns supreme as today's TV polling guru. He joins Alex today. But not everybody takes the pollsters at face value. Online commentators in particular lambast the mainstream media's abuse of polls in their coverage. Again, there's nothing new in this. In the 1945 election, when Gallup was correctly predicting a Labour landslide, the Daily Express pollsters were forecasting a dead heat. Alex speaks to James Kelly of the Scottish website Scot Goes Pop. All this later in the show. But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week. William Nicholl says, yes, excellent show. Time the countries of the world were left to solve their own problems, as you rightly mentioned. Money used for war, instead used for improvement in ordinary people's quality of life. Ivan Eldrick says, sensitive and reasoned analysis by Peter and Alex. Much better than the dog whistle reporting we see on many MSM channels. Gordon Mackenzie says, always enjoy listening to Peter Oborne. Honest observations and always to the point. Teresa says, Peter Oborne is excellent, very informative. Mohammed Abdullah says, why did Theresa May fail so badly as Prime Minister? She speaks a lot of sense as an MP. Doan says, USA cannot betray the slogan, nobody left behind. Where are they now? Bob Howie says, this is what hope looks like. Most empires have invaded Afghanistan through the ages because it was a trade gateway. All failed. The Americans are only the latest. If the West stopped trying to make the Middle East a Western society, they would have the only hope they can have, and not the hope of escaping it, as this latest excursion has proven. Professor Sir John Curtice is today's uncrowned king of the TV pollsters. Alex interviews him about the long history of political polling.
Professor Sir John Curtice, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Nice to be here, Alex.
Let's go back to almost the dawn of political polling in the United Kingdom, the 1945 general election. Now, here was a situation where the News Chronicle, one of the great papers of the day, were featuring Gallup polls for 2 years before the election. Virtually everyone showed a Labour landslide lead, but nobody believed that was possible. What was going on?
Well, the truth is that this was the first election at which opinion polling was taking place. The previous one, the general election, of course, had been back in 1935, and the advent of Gallup's polls really dates from the late 1930s, particularly in the wake of their success in forecasting that Roosevelt was going to win the 1936 US presidential election, when a now infamous Reader's poll done by Reader's Digest suggested that he was going to lose. That was when Gallup really gained their reputation. But the 1945 election, just after the Second World War, was the first opportunity for Gallup to do its polling in the UK. Now, of course, most people thought that because Winston Churchill was Prime Minister and Winston Churchill was the person who had delivered a victory for the United Kingdom in the Second World War, that therefore, of course, he would be re-elected as Prime Minister. But, of course, the electorate decided otherwise. And that, in a sense, therefore, helped to cement the idea that opinion polls could indeed sometimes tell us something that we wouldn't otherwise know. Not that opinion polls have always been believed ever since. I certainly can remember on many occasions before the 1997 UK general election, where, of course, the Labour Party also got a landslide. But partly because of what the polls had somewhat overestimated Labour's position in 1992. Lots of people did not believe that Labour was going to get a landslide. But again, on this occasion, at least, the polls got it right.
So what in recent history has been the greatest polling disaster? I mean, what's been the occasion when the pollsters, or most of them, or perhaps even all of them, had egg all over their faces?
Yeah, well, there were three of those undoubtedly edged on the hearts of any opinion pollster inside the UK. The first is 1970, the election that Howard Wilson called quite suddenly off the back of a rise in Labour's opinion poll standing. And the opinion polls kept on suggesting that he was going to win. Actually, some late polling, particularly one poll done by Opinion Research Centre, suggested that maybe there was a late swing and maybe actually Ted Heath was going to make it. Well, indeed, Ted Heath did make it. And that resulted in the first substantial inquiry into why the polls got it wrong. And the answer was essentially yeah, indeed, there was a late swing. And you have to remember back in those days, opinion polls were being conducted by interviewers going out and knocking on people's doors. So they couldn't be done at the last minute in the same way as they can be now and are done essentially over the internet. So that was the first one. The second one was 1992, when the opinion polls seemed to suggest that perhaps the Labour Party was at least going to deny the Conservatives an overall majority, maybe would have a hung parliament. In the end, the Conservatives got their fourth term. The reason there perhaps was essentially to do with the fact that the samples were not necessarily as accurate as they should be, and that perhaps in particular they oversampled people living in social housing. And then finally, 2015, where again the polls suggested that perhaps we're going to get a hung parliament, and then in practice David Cameron got an overall majority. And that undoubtedly a very substantial exercise headed by Patrick Sturgis, now at the LSE, on behalf of the British Polling Council, said basically the samples were wrong. In particular, one of the difficulties that began to rise by 2015 was that the Labour Party was a lot more popular amongst younger voters than it was amongst older voters. A big age gap now in how people vote. And one of the different things that polls find it difficult to get right is who's going to turn out to vote and who doesn't. And younger voters are less likely to vote. So it's pretty clear that at that election, the polls underestimated the age differences in turnout. In other words, they overestimated the proportion of younger people who are going to turn out and vote, because that's the younger people whom they could get hold of said they were going to do. But their peers who the polls didn't get hold of stayed at home, some of them, and therefore they ended up overestimating Labour's vote share. So three great disasters written on the hearts of pollsters. One, by the way, that is not a disaster, but is often cited as the 2016 EU referendum. Actually, some of the polls for that said that actually the Leave side were going to win. And if you take all of the polls that were conducted during the EU referendum campaign, slightly more said that Leave were going to be ahead than Remain. That always looked very close. It was close. It's just that, again, I think in part, nobody could believe that the country would vote Leave. Therefore, the polls that suggested that we might were discounted.
Now, I remember the 2015 election. I was rather counting on that hung parliament that the polls were forecasting. But given all these changes and all these inquiries, is that impossible now? Is it going to be plain sailing for pollsters from now on? Have you ironed out all these difficulties? No, I mean,
the honest truth is, Alex, that, I mean, opinion polling is always a difficult art. The circumstances change. So, I mean, again, one very simple thing. If we go back 30 years or so, whether or not people voted Conservative or Labour, and that data will allow me to point out that for the most part, that's what most people did, even in Scotland. Basically working class people were much more likely to vote Labour, middle class people were much more likely to vote Conservative. Those days are over. In the 2019 election, Labour was no more popular amongst working class voters than it was amongst middle class voters, and the Conservatives were probably slightly more successful amongst working class voters than Labour were, largely, though not entirely, the result of Brexit. Now, that changed circumstance means that pollsters who used to spend a lot of time making sure they had at least the right number of middle class voters and working class voters in their polls, that's now irrelevant. On the other hand, whether or not you've got a degree or not now matters quite a lot in the wake of Brexit. But actually getting accurate information about somebody's educational qualifications is quite difficult because there is so many qualifications, particularly if you're thinking about an electorate that's been educated over a 50-year period. Getting accurate information about that is rather difficult, but that's now something pollsters have had to start to grapple with. In other words, what they're trying to get at changes over time, and at the same time, methodology changes over time. So I've already said, it's now mostly done over the internet. That has lots of advantages, but it has disadvantages. Not everybody's on the internet, and not everybody's willing to answer internet polls quickly, and that's some of the downsides. Until really the late 1980s, it was all being done face-to-face, so-called quota sampling. So the methodology changes, but the circumstance change. And then, of course, in somewhere like Scotland, the party system completely changes. And Scotland is now, of course, dominated by the SNP. And so therefore, again, the circumstances change, what you're trying to measure has changed, and therefore the challenge changes.
And how do pollsters, not necessarily in election polls, but in between elections, how do pollsters protect themselves against nefarious newspapers who might present a marginal change in polling as if it was some dramatic effect? I mean, going back to 1945, while Gallup were forecasting a Labour landslide, miraculously the Daily Express were forecasting a dead heat on polling. So how do pollsters protect themselves against nefarious newspapers?
Well, this is undoubtedly something of a potentially quite difficult area. I mean, I can tell you as President of the British Polling Council, what we do is that we do now require all our member companies, and basically all of virtually everybody who does opinion polling in the UK is signed up to its rules. And one of its many rules is that every time an opinion poll goes out, we remind people, the polling company reminds people, look, opinion polls are within about 4 points of the true value about 95% of the time. But, if the movement between two polls is, less than 4 points, it may just simply be the random variation to which all polls are subject, and nothing really may necessarily have changed. Well, that's what the pollsters say. But there is no doubt that news values tends to dictate that, even a rise of a couple of points, it will get headlined, particularly even worse. If the Conservative lead in the opinion polls drops by 2 or 3 points, it will be suggested that, Boris Johnson is potentially in trouble, or boost for Keir Starmer. Well, actually, 2 or 3 movements on the lead is something that could very, very easily happen as a result of sampling error. But the truth is, Alex, the pollsters try to keep people honest by the way in which they report their polls, and they do all the time provide a health warning. But it's very difficult to stop the newspapers, particularly in the headlines, perhaps claiming more for what their opinion polls say than perhaps some of us who were wanting more judicious suggest is perhaps wise.
Coming up after the break, Alex continues his discussions with Professor Sir John Curtice. Welcome back. Alex continues his discussions with Professor Sir John Curtice and is then joined by James Kelly of the blog Scot Goes Pop.
Tell me a little about Professor Sir John Curtice. I mean, did you grow up looking at David Butler and Bob Mackenzie and the swingometer and saying, my goodness, I want to do that? Was it always your ambition to become the #1 political pundit for pollsters?
No, but what is true is that, shall we say, I had an unusually early interest in politics and in how people vote. So my first political memory is the death of Hugh Gaitskell in 1963 and the subsequent leadership election that Harold Wilson won against James Callaghan. And that's the point at which I started reading newspapers and took an interest in this leadership election. I then remember being allowed to stay up by my parents, so this is what, age 9, 10, for the 1964 election programme, which of course was David Butler and Bob Mackenzie.
And the cliffhanger.
Indeed, and I remember following the cliffhanger the following day. but I was allowed to stay up for a while until 10 or 11 o'clock. So I saw the beginning of that program. So I was watching it, and I certainly followed that cliffhanger. Fast forward, when I became a graduate student in 1976, my supervisor was indeed Sir David Butler, as he now is. And so it's the same person who indeed was, one of the two television gurus. So I actually have been behind the scenes at each and every general election since 1979. But for a long time, basically behind the scenes, and then started doing local elections for pretty much every round of English local elections from 1981 onwards. So I've actually done over 40 years of elections. I'm now, I think, the longest running person on the BBC crew now that David Dimbleby has finally retired, because 1979 was David's first one. But most of the time, actually working on the production side, which actually I think is much more fun. But eventually, more recently, I've been dragged much more into the front of camera. Not least, of course, because that independence referendum, for which you had a certain responsibility, where, of course, Scotland's a relatively small place, and anybody who could say anything about what was going on in the referendum was much in demand by any television station that was going. So that undoubtedly raised my profile. So the answer is it's serendipity of the people who I knew early on in my career who got me inside a television studio, and then after that, gradually, people deciding to put me in front of camera as well as behind camera, and therefore my becoming a relatively well-kept face.
Well, I'm pleased to have helped provide a boost to your television profile, John. Of all that time, do you have an absolute favourite election? Is there,
yes.
Of all that experience, is there something you can pick out and say, yeah, I'm glad I was covering that one?
Yeah, undoubtedly my favourite moment of all the various general elections I've been involved in is 1997. And it is the Portillo moment. It was the moment that Michael Portillo lost his seat. And not least of the reasons why I remember that is that I was indeed sitting in my bunker. I was doing what I've been doing at a number of elections, which was analysing the results as they came in, and telling people like David Dimbleby and the late Professor Anthony King, who was the BBC's front person for a long time, a very urbane and very, very good broadcaster. But I was doing a lot of the analysis behind the scenes and feeding them lines about what was going on, et cetera, et cetera. And I had a BBC producer with me called Sean O'Grady, who's long since had a stellar career on The Independent. But Sean's job was to keep on prodding me to be doing this, that, and the other, to be informing the programme. And Sean was telling me not long enough as well, what more have we got to say? And I said, Sean, sit down, shut up. We're not going to get anything on air for the next 2 hours. This is high political drama. And until that is played out, nobody's going to care tuppence halfpenny about the fact that the swing is slightly greater in the north of England than it is in the south of England, or whatever. So that's undoubtedly, I think, the most dramatic of nights, partly because of the fact that so many people lost their seats, but also because so many people couldn't believe that that could possibly happen.
Professor Sir John Curtice, polling guru extraordinaire, thank you so much for joining me in the Alex Salmond Show.
Not at all. You're welcome.
But not everyone is as confident in the art of political polling and its uses. I'm now joined by James Kelly of the blog Scot Goes Pop. James, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Hi, Alex. Good to be here. How are you?
I'm very well, but your blog has a note of scepticism about opinion polls, or at least about the use of opinion polls. I mean, what's all that about?
Well, obviously, I'm a pro-independence blogger in Scotland, and in Scotland, we have a problem with the media, which is overwhelmingly anti-independence or sceptical about independence. Almost the entire mainstream media, with the exception of one newspaper, is against independence, and they're the ones that are commissioning the polls. And so you're going to get an agenda creeping in. You're going to get, omissions, questions that are asked or that aren't asked, or that if the question goes the wrong way, maybe those results will be downplayed. maybe results will be misinterpreted slightly. So it's more the kind of the relationship between polls and the media that I think is the problem in Scotland.
But you're not suggesting that YouGov or any of these other highly reputable polling organisations are distorting the information, are you?
Well, I think sometimes the information comes back and the media distorts it. You know, numerous examples of, you know, for example, a newspaper editor took a result which only applied in the run-up to the 2015 election when the SNP won by a landslide. He took the results of a poll that only covered Labour-held constituencies, and then he put it into a predictor which covered the whole of Scotland, you know, for national results, and then presented the seats projection as if it was a national result. And people pointed out what he'd done, but they're oblivious to it. It was just bulldoze through. So you put nonsense in, you get nonsense out. And the media do have this habit of misrepresenting polls to suit themselves, sometimes in quite a, you know, it's not even you could say it was a misinterpretation. It's just wrong what they're actually doing. They make factually inaccurate claims about their polls.
Does any of this make a difference? I mean, your example from the 2015 election, one of the unionist newspapers distorting the results of a single opinion poll, it didn't do them any good. The SNP still won that election in a landslide. So, I mean, what does it matter about the odd distortion here and there?
Yeah, I think this is the big question, whether, you know, this relentless distortion actually makes any difference, or whether, you know, a run of poor results can make any difference. You know, as you know, in the run-up to the 2014 election and run-up to the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence, certainly in 2013, there was a whole string of polls showing absolutely dreadful results for the Yes campaign, for the pro-independence campaign. And my concern was that was sort of sucking the life out of the campaign. And, you know, people wouldn't really engage with the campaign because they're thinking, right, this is just something we're going through the motions with. This is something we already know the outcome of. And people were probably approaching it in a very different way than they would from a genuinely competitive election or referendum. And I thought that might, you know, make it almost impossible for Yes to make up that ground. But of course, as you know, that's not the case. And Yes did make up that ground. So perhaps it doesn't matter. But I still think it's a cause for concern, because that was never going to do anything else. If it was going to make any difference, it was always going to harm the Yes campaign and not the No campaign.
Well, I tell you a secret, James. I was hoping that the polls wouldn't show a Yes lead until the referendum day, and we'd sneak up and catch them at the end. And it was greatly to our misfortune, in my view, as the leader of the Yes campaign back in the day, that Sunday Times poll showed Yes ahead with 10 days to go. I'd have much rather that hadn't happened. So sometimes being behind in the polls is not a bad thing.
I think that's a good point. As long as you're a little bit behind, you know, as long as you're competitive, but you're not actually ahead, maybe that's the ideal place to be. But those polls in 2013 were, you know, showing anything up to a 2-to-1 majority for No. And I think when it's like that, when it doesn't even look competitive, people are just thinking, well, why would I even bother thinking about this? Because we already know the outcome. As long as it's competitive, maybe there is an advantage to being the underdog. But I think if you're that far behind, and if you're being presented as being that far behind, potentially it's a problem.
But haven't you got a foot in both camps? I know your blog regularly advertises so as you can do your own polls. I mean, goodness sake, how can you criticise these dreadful pollsters and then be dipping into the whole thing yourself?
Well, we have to even things up a bit, don't we? I mean, if we're having all these polls that are pushed from a sort of unionist inclined questions, we might as well do a little bit in the other direction and sort of even things up slightly. So that's for being slightly cynical about it. Maybe that was one reason for doing it.
Well, I noticed in your blog you've taken to using exaggerated headlines. I mean, is this your sort of commentary on some of the unionist tabloids, giving them a taste of their own medicine?
Yeah, you know, like the Daily Express, any poll that comes out, regardless of what it shows, you know, bombshell poll, hammer blow for Sturgeon, independence, hopes dashed, shattered, annihilated, you know, so just a slight ironic response to that.
So you've been doing the opposite then? You've been saying massive boost for independence campaign, even if it's a 1% shift.
Absolutely, why not?
But what would your advice be? I mean, to people reading your blog, I mean, would your advice be to treat the polls with a pinch of salt, or to say, well, over the piece, they tend to show trends that you should take notice of? I mean, what would your advice as a blogger be to people looking at opinion polls?
Sometimes what will happen is that, you know, for example, the independence question in Scotland, an anti-independence client will come along, like an anti-independence pressure group or something will come along, commission a poll asking a question that isn't really about independence. And they'll put out a press release showing, terrible drop in support for independence, and the newspapers will report that. You just basically regurgitate the press release and you find that actually the question asked was nothing about independence. It was a completely different question that was being presented as if it was. So you have to look at what the question is, I think, before you jump to the conclusions that the trend can be meaningful.
So is there any truth in the rumour that Scot Goes Pop are going to commission a poll in independence which says that if you were persuaded that sometime in the future that Scotland would definitely be a land of milk and honey with independence, would you consider voting for it at any point? Is that your question?
That's a really good idea. That's going to go into the next poll.
James Kelly of Scot Goes Pop, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alex.
The only poll that counts is election day. Well, so says every politician facing adverse opinion polls. But every politician pays heed to the polling, and the polls can set the temperature of election campaigns. Particularly in by-elections, there are plenty of examples of single polls changing the entire mood of the election. And given the often shameless abuse of polling by a partisan press, it opens up the argument that polling should be banned in the immediate run-up to polling day. In reality, the art of manipulating poll results hasn't changed much since Sir Humphrey Appleby instructed the naive Bernard Woolley on how to produce the answers which were wanted in a classic edition of Yes Minister. However sophisticated the science of polling becomes, there will still be both forecasting triumphs and disasters, and pollsters will likely have a balance of plaudits and brickbats for some time to come. But for now, from Alex, myself, and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you again next week.